Now we enter part 2 of the crash course. Here you'll see the very information that led me and my family to make profound changes in our lives. Where we live, my line of work, even where we get our food. With the background you've received to this point, you are now positioned to understand how the 3 E's, the economy, energy, and the environment, intersect and seemingly converge on a very narrow window of the future, what I am calling the 20 teens. It's the data in these next parts that leads me to conclude that the next 20 years are going to be completely unlike the last 20 years. A small warning, this material can be shocking. And so we begin part 2 with debt. We're going to pick up 2 more key concepts in this section, and one of them is utterly essential, and it's this. Ever-growing debts implicitly assume that the future will be larger than the present. We'll be examining this statement in detail in this chapter. Before we go there, a few definitions are in order. A financial debt is a contractual obligation to repay a specified amount of money at some point in the future. The concept of debt is thoroughly characterized within the legal system so that we can say that a debt is a legal contract providing money today in exchange for repayment in the future. With interest, of course. Debts come in many forms. Auto loans and mortgage debt are known as secured debts because there's a recoverable asset attached to the debt. Credit card debt is known as unsecured because no specific asset can be directly seized in the event of a default. For you and I, there are only 2 ways to settle a debt: pay it off or default on it. If you have a printing press like the government does, a third option exists: printing money to pay for the debt. This method is a poorly disguised form of taxation since it forcefully removes value from all existing money and transfers that value to the debt holders. I view it as a form of default, but one that preferentially punishes savers and those least able to bear the impact of inflation. The pure debt obligations of the U.S. government as of April 2008 stand at $9,444 billion and change. This is only the debt. Once we add in the liabilities of the U.S. government, chiefly Medicare and Social Security, we get a number 5 to 8 times larger than this. We'll be discussing these liabilities in the next chapter, so that's all I'm going to say about them right now. Right now, we are focused simply on debt, and it's enough to know that debt is only part of the whole story. Next, this is a chart of total U.S. debt. That's federal, state, municipal, corporate, and private debts in the red line, compared against total national income in the yellow line. The total debt in the United States now stands at over $48 trillion. That's 48 stacks of $1,000 bills, each of which is 67.9 miles high. If we adjust these debt levels for both population and inflation over time, so that we're comparing apples to apples, we find that in 1952 there was the equivalent of $76,000 in total debt per person, and that today the number is $183,000. At $183,000 per head, this means that today, the average family of 4 in America is associated with $732,000 of debt. This is a useful way to look at debt because it doesn't really matter if the debt is owed by a government agency or a corporation or an individual, because these are really the debts of our country, and all debts get paid through the actions of people. So examining the debts on a per capita or a household basis gives us a sense of the situation. Can debts forever grow faster than the incomes that service them? No, they cannot. There's a mathematical limit in there somewhere. Am I saying that all debt is bad? No, I'm not. Time for another definition. Debt that can best be described as investment debt provides the opportunity to pay itself back. An example would be a college loan offering the opportunity to earn a higher wage in the future. Another would be a loan to expand the seating at a successful restaurant. In the parlance of bankers, these are examples of self-liquidating debt, meaning that the loans boost future revenues and have a means of paying themselves back. But what about loans that are merely consumptive in nature, such as those taken out for a fancier car or for vacations or for more war materiel? These are called non-self-liquidating debts because they do not generate any additional future revenue. So not all debts are bad. Only too much unproductive borrowing is bad. In the past 5 years, American debt has grown by more than $16 trillion, and a very large proportion of that has been the non-self-liquidating variety. This has profound implications for the future, because non-self-liquidating loans do not generate future cash flows. It means that ordinary income will have to be used to pay off today's consumption. And this will mean less cash for discretionary spending in the future. So what is debt really? Well, debt provides us money to spend today. Perhaps we buy a car, and we enjoy that car today. But in the future, loan payments represent money that we do not have then to spend on other items. So we can say that debt represents future consumption taken today. Now, as long as it's my decision to go into debt and the repayments are solely my responsibility, then everything's cool. However, once we consider that our current levels of debt will require the effort of future generations to pay them back, we start to trend into the moral aspect of this story. Is it really proper for one generation to consume well beyond its means and expect the following generations to forego their consumption to pay it all back? That is precisely our current situation, and these charts say as much. I often wonder if my children are going to accept this bargain. I have my doubts. Now, we learned in Section 4 that money can be viewed as a claim on human labor. And we just learned that debt is really just a claim on future money. So we can put these two statements together and arrive at key concept number 6. Debt is a claim on future human labor. When we get to the section on baby boomers and the demographic challenge facing our country, I'll be recalling this very important concept. When viewed historically and compared to gross domestic product, the current levels of debt are completely without precedent. This chart even suggests that our recent lives have been entirely spent in the largest credit bubble in history. Current total credit market debt stands now at more than 340% of total gross domestic product. As we can see on this chart, the last time debts even got remotely close to current levels was back in the 1930s, and that bears a bit of explanation. The easy credit policies of the Fed gave us the roaring 20s, and then a burst credit bubble, which was followed by 11 years of economic contraction and hardship, which we now refer to as the Great Depression. Note that the debt to GDP ratio didn't start to climb until after 1929. What's the explanation for this? Were more loans being made? No. The chart climbs here because while the debts remained fixed, it was the economy that fell away from under them, creating this spike. In the absence of the Great Depression anomaly, our country always held less than 200% of our GDP in debt. And it's only since the mid-1980s that that relationship was violated. So we can say that our current experiment with these levels of debt is only 23 years old, and therefore an historically brief phenomenon. And so it is this chart, more than any other, that leads me to conclude that the next 20 years are going to be completely unlike the last 20 years. I just cannot see how we can pull off another 20 years just like that area circled in red. Based on the shape of this chart, our entire financial universe has made a rather substantial and collective assumption about the future. Because a debt is a claim on the future, each incremental expansion of the level of debt is an implicit assumption that the future will be larger than today. Which means there's a very profound assumption baked right into this debt chart, and that is, the future will be larger than the present. Here's what I mean. A debt is always paid off in the future, and loans are made with the expectation that they'll be paid back, with interest. If more credits are extended this year than last, then that means there's an expectation, an assumption, that the ability exists to pay those loans back in the future. Given that our debts are now over 340% of GDP, there's an explicit assumption here that the future GDP is going to be larger than today's. A lot larger. More cars sold, more resources consumed, more money earned, more houses built, all of it must be larger than today, just to offer the chance of paying back the loans we've already taken on. But each quarter, we see that new debts are being made at a rate 5 to 6 times faster than the growth in the underlying economy. Even with a fairly optimistic assessment of future growth, this trajectory is clearly unsustainable. Our banks, our pension funds, governmental structure, and everything else tied to the continued expansion of debt has an enormous stake in its perpetual growth. And so here we come to our 7th key concept of the crash course. Our debt markets assume that the future will be much larger than the present. But what happens if that's not true? What if the means to repay all those claims does not arrive in the future? Well, broadly speaking, if that comes to pass, there's only one result with 2 different means of making it happen. The result is that the claims, the debts, must be diminished somehow, and that could happen either by a process of debt defaults or by inflation. The defaults are easy to explain. The debts don't get repaid and the holders of that debt don't get their money back. Boom, the claims get diminished. In this instance, if the future isn't large enough to pay back the claims, then defaults are simply a way of not paying them back. The inflation route can be confusing, so think of it this way. What if you sold your house to someone and elected to hold a note for $500,000? The terms call for the note to be repaid all at once in 10 years as a single payment of $650,000. Well, what if you get paid your $650,000 right on time, but that $650,000 will only buy this house? You got paid all right, but your claim on the future was vastly diminished by inflation. In the default scenario, your money is still worth something, but you don't get it back. In the inflation scenario, you get it back, but it hardly buys anything. In both cases, your future was diminished, so the impact is very nearly the same, but the means of achieving it are wildly different. So the questions you need to ponder for yourself are, have too many claims been made on the future? And if so, will we face inflation or defaults as the means of squaring things up? You will arrive at wildly different life decisions depending on whether you answer yes or no to the first question, and inflation or defaults to the second question. So they are worth pondering. Alright, here's what we learned. Key concept number 6. Debt is a claim on future human labor. Second, per capita debt has never been higher. We are in truly unprecedented territory in this country. Debt has increased by $16 trillion in the past 5 years, and most of it consumptive debt. This means that future consumption will have to be seriously curtailed, or will enter a period of debt destruction, either by defaults or inflation. And finally, key concept number 7. Our debt markets assume that the future will be much larger than the present. Our entire economic system, and by extension our way of life, is founded on debt. And debt is founded on the assumption that the future will always be bigger than the past. Therefore, it is utterly vital that we examine this assumption closely, because if this assumption is false, so are a lot of other things we may be taking for granted. If you've just seen the previous chapter on debt, then you might be wondering if either our savings or our assets are of sufficient quantity to make those levels of debt perfectly manageable. In the next chapter, I'll deal with assets. In this chapter, I will present evidence that the United States has failed to save money at virtually every level of society, and make the claim that the United States government is insolvent. I use that term precisely, whereas bankruptcy is a legal process that begins once cash flows can no longer meet current obligations. Insolvency happens when one's liabilities exceed one's assets, and is the first step on the road towards bankruptcy. The purpose of the crash course is to give you the context and the data you need to be able to accurately assess the likelihoods and risks that our economy faces over the next few years. My position is that the next 20 years are going to be completely unlike the last 20 years. And to support this statement, I'm going to take you through 6 key areas of data: debt, savings, assets, demographics, peak oil, and climate change. Any one of these could prove economically challenging, but the combination of 2 or more simultaneously, well, I'll leave that for you to assess. This is a chart of the personal savings rate stretching back to 1959. The personal savings rate is the difference between income and expenditures for all U.S. citizens, expressed as a percentage. So a number like 10% indicates that for every dollar earned, 10 cents was saved, not spent. Note that the long-term historical average for U.S. citizens between 1959 and 1985 was 9.2%. For comparison, in Europe, that number is around 10%, and in China, a stunning 30% of income is saved. Savings are important to us individually because they form the cash cushion that gets us through economic difficulties, and at the national level because savings are essential to the formation of investment capital. That is, the property, plant, and equipment that create actual future wealth. You may have read or heard recently that the personal savings rate has plunged to historic lows, last associated with the Great Depression. In fact, the personal savings rate has steadily declined from 1985 to present, indicating that those headlines we just saw were not some very recent blip on the radar, but rather the culmination of a 23-year erosion of savings as a cultural attribute of U.S. citizens. However, we are not a nation of averages, and this chart somewhat obscures the fact that the extremely wealthy are saving incredible amounts of money, while at the lower ends, the savings rate is deeply negative. Why is that important? Because as the Greek philosopher Plutarch once stated, an imbalance between the rich and the poor is the oldest and most fatal ailment of all republics. What else can we note about this chart? For starters, a persistently declining savings rate tells us that there is an implicit assumption by the majority that credit will be available in the future. As we look at this chart, we might also note that the savings rate began its decline right around 1985. Wait a minute. Didn't we see that same time frame in the last section on debt? Why, yes we did. While this chart is showing all debt across all sectors, and the prior chart was of personal savings only, we can note that our national tolerance of debt shifted drastically upwards beginning in 1985, right as our national approach to savings was beginning its long decline towards zero. In order to believe that the future is going to be bigger, shinier, and brighter than the present, you have to believe that low savings and high debts are a path to prosperity. I am skeptical, to say the least, because this just doesn't make sense to me. It violates several laws of nature. Another category of savings is pensions and retirement funds. At the state and municipal levels, we can observe that they too have failed to save, and state and municipal pensions are underfunded to the tune of $1 trillion. What this means is that as money was taken in from taxes, states and municipalities actively chose to spend that money elsewhere, in preference to putting it into pension funds. The idea there, we can guess, was to spend money today and let someone else figure out how to pay for it in the future. Well, for many states, the future has finally arrived. What does it mean when we say that the state and municipal pensions are underfunded by $1 trillion? How is that calculated? The $1 trillion shortfall is what is called a net present value, or NPV amount. A net present value calculation adds up all the cash inflows, in this hypothetical example, $1,000 per year for 6 years, and offsets those cash flows, or nets them against all future cash outflows. Since $1 today is worth more than $1 in the future, however, the future cash flows have to be discounted and brought back to the present. We net all the cash inflows and costs, we discount them back to the present to determine if the thing we are measuring has a positive or negative value. Net present value. This is the methodology used to calculate the status of state and municipal pension funds. Growth in the value of the pension fund assets, plus future taxes, are offset against cash outlays to pensioners, and brought back to the present, to indicate that in order for the pension funds to simply have a zero value, $1 trillion would, today, have to be placed into those funds. An important realization about NPV calculations is that the future has already been largely taken into account, so waiting and hoping for a different future result to emerge pretty much never works. If we have to place $1 trillion in the funds today, but don't do this, next year the number will only be larger. The only way it could be smaller is if fewer people are collecting benefits, or the fund's assets outperform the assumed rate of growth that fed the NPV calculation. Moving right along, corporations are coming off the highest levels of profitability in decades, but they too opted to underfund their pensions to the tune of $1.5 trillion net present value dollars, in preference for other uses for that cash. Because pensions typically invest in bonds and stocks, in a roughly 60-40 split, any recessions or market declines will only add to the shortfall. In part, the pension shortfalls are a direct function of the extremely low interest rates currently available. Thanks, Greenspan and Bernanke! And also because the main stock market index is pretty much at the same level it was 9 years ago, and that's only if we don't inflation adjust the results. If we did, we'd have to go back a bit further. Since most pension funds assume an 8 to 10% yearly return, and since the stock market has had a zero gain for 9 years, the pension shortfalls are perfectly understandable. But when we get to the federal government, that's when the scary numbers emerge. David Walker, the recently retired comptroller of the U.S. and a personal hero of mine, said of the U.S. government, "Its financial position is worse than advertised. It has a broken business model. It faces deficits in its budget, its balance of payments, its savings, and its leadership." Wow, those are some pretty strong words. In my assessment, he's absolutely right. And here's some data to support that. This is a table taken right from the U.S. government annual report found on the Treasury Department website. Again, we are going to be looking at NPV numbers. The first is a nearly $9 trillion shortfall representing the total U.S. government net position, without including Social Security and Medicare. Again, this means that all U.S. government cash inflows, plus the value of all government assets, would have to be offset against known outlays to determine that, today, the U.S. government would have to somehow obtain $8.9 trillion to balance its liabilities against its assets. But that's not even the 1/5 of it. Once we add in Social Security and Medicare, the shortfall suddenly balloons to $53 trillion by the Treasury Department's own calculations. Whoa, stop right there. That's more than 4 times GDP. This means that the U.S. government is insolvent. Why is this not topic number 1 on the presidential campaign trail? A country this far in hock has some real future issues and is potentially on its way to bankruptcy. In case you are harboring the notion that there's some money socked away in a special U.S. government account, like a lockbox, this picture shows George Bush standing next to the entire Social Security trust fund. Yep, there it is. The entire trust fund is a 3-ring binder with slips of paper in it saying that the U.S. government has spent all the money and replaced it with special Treasury bonds. Hold on there. Aren't Treasury bonds an obligation of the U.S. government? How can the government owe itself money? It can't. All government revenue either comes from taxpayers or borrowing. So when the time comes to pay off those special bonds, that money will either come from taxpayers or additional borrowing. If it were possible to owe money to yourself and pay interest to boot, then we could all become fabulously wealthy by writing ourselves checks. But, of course, this is a foolish, easily dispelled notion. At any rate, depending on which government agency's numbers you use, the federal shortfall is anywhere from $53 trillion to $85 trillion. This number is so large that it even scares small monkeys. And proving the point that you cannot grow your way out of an NPV shortfall, this number has grown by nearly $40 trillion over the past 10 years, advancing during both strong and weak economic times. And finally, saving is related to investing. And according to the American Society of Civil Engineers, we've fallen short there as well. In 2005, they assessed the condition of 12 categories of infrastructure, including bridges, roadways, drinking water systems, and wastewater treatment plants. They gave the U.S. an overall grade of D and calculated that $1.6 trillion would be needed over the next 5 years to bring us back up to first world standards. Since that was in 2005, and inflation for things made out of metal and asphalt has advanced enormously since then, let's just round that up to, say, an even $2 trillion. Putting it all together, we find that a personal failure to save is reflected by a state and local failure to save, which are themselves mirrored by a corporate failure to save, all dwarfed by a failure to save at the federal government level. And capping it all off is a profound failure to invest. All of these deficits lie before us and lead me to conclude that the next 20 years are going to be completely unlike the last 20 years. This is our legacy, the economic and physical world that we are choosing to leave to those who follow us. How did we get here? How did this happen? Chapter 14, Assets and Demographics. As we learned in previous sections, our nation has historic, never-before-seen levels of debt and an historic failure to save. Now, some would say it's not reasonable to look only at debt and savings. One also has to consider assets. After all, does it really matter if you have no savings and $1 million of debt if you have assets worth $10 million? Well, that's a great point. So we're going to take a look at assets here. Alright, so what's an asset? One definition is items of ownership convertible into cash, total resources of a person or business as cash, notes and accounts receivable, securities, inventories, goodwill, fixtures, machinery, or real estate. So, an asset is something of value that can be converted to cash or provides access to or enhances a flow of cash. If we said simply that assets are deposits, real estate, stocks or bonds, and the stuff we own, we'd pretty much cover the vast majority of what we consider to be our assets. As we saw earlier, the liabilities and assets of the U.S. and state governments are really the liabilities of its citizens. But do remember, as we noted in Chapter 13, the U.S. government has a total net worth of negative $50 to $85 trillion. In fact, that mismatch between assets and liabilities does not belong to the U.S. government. It belongs to you and me and everybody else. Our national debts and liabilities are, well, ours. On the private side, the assets of companies belong entirely to the bondholders and shareholders of that company, not the company itself. And who are those? Ultimately, private citizens. Since we can pool citizens into households, we could examine household assets, deduct some relevant liabilities, and get a decent view of where things stand. And we do this because the Federal Reserve happens to track net worth at the household level, and this data is routinely and widely reported in the media. In fact, according to the Federal Reserve, household net worth has exploded by nearly $20 trillion in only 5 years, an astonishing feat, and it represents more wealth than our country managed to amass from its inception until the late 1980s. And these are net assets, so the Federal Reserve and many in the media take the position that with just under $60 trillion in net worth, Americans are doing just fine and our rapidly climbing levels of debt are no cause for concern. But before we get too excited about the astonishing wealth indicated here, there are two key oversights and a fallacy hidden in this report, of which you should be aware. As always, the devil's in the details. Before I address those, I want you to observe this period right here, spanning from 2000 to 2003. That dip in the net worth of households was due to the stock market collapse that ran from 2000 to 2003, and caused such great panic at the Fed that Greenspan lowered interest rates to the emergency rate of 1%, thereby igniting the greatest of housing and credit bubbles in all of history. And this decline in net worth leads to this observation. Debt is fixed. When you take on a debt, there it placidly sits, until and unless you make payments on it. Debts do not vary with the general economic conditions, or whether you get a raise or lose your job. Assets, on the other hand, are variable, sometimes gaining and sometimes losing value. And so this leads to the 8th key concept of the crash course. Debts are fixed, but assets are variable. Okay, where did that $19.8 trillion in new wealth come from? Well, about 80% of that growth came from a rise in financial assets, and the remaining 20% came from growth in real estate and other tangible assets. When we look at how much of each type there was, we see that 72% of the total net worth consists of financial assets, totaling about $41 trillion, while the tangible assets are the remaining 28% and total around $16 trillion. If we examine these assets a little more closely, we see that the $41 trillion worth of financial assets consist of things like pension funds, the assets of privately held businesses, deposits, stocks, and bonds, which we can roughly recompose into these 4 main classes: stocks, bonds, cash or deposits, and the assets of privately held businesses. The other bucket of $16 trillion in tangible assets consists primarily of real estate, which is 75% of this bucket, and consumer durables, which would be your car, your dryer, and your snowblower if you happen to have one. For every single one of all of these assets on this page, except cash, in order to liberate the wealth from these assets, you'd have to sell them first. Now, one general rule of asset markets goes like this. Things go up in price when there are more buyers than sellers, and things go down in price when there are more sellers than buyers. Hold on to that thought, for when we get to demographics. Now, let me expose a great fallacy of the household wealth report. I'll use real estate to make the point. Suppose you have a house that you bought for $250,000, and over time, say the last 5 years, it went up in assessed value to $500,000. The Fed would record this as a $250,000 increase in your net wealth. But there's really no way for you to easily get to that wealth. Sure, you could borrow against that, but that does not liberate the wealth. It only exchanges an amount of it for debt. But suppose that you sold your house. Well, if you wanted to move into an equivalent house, guess what? They've all gone up in price along with yours, and so you have to spend $500,000 for an equivalent house. So, nope, no wealth was liberated there. In fact, the only way to liberate the wealth in your house is to downsize and buy a smaller one, or rent. So here's the rhetorical question of the day. How could everyone downsize? You might be able to, but on balance, everybody can't. At least not without creating a massive glut of large homes and a desperate shortage of smaller ones. And if everyone can't do this, then it means that it's impossible to ever release the full value or embodied wealth of all the houses. So the wealth number is fun to look at individually, but it is more or less meaningless as a whole. This same dynamic is true for other assets as well. Sufficient buyers are essential, or the wealth is as good as stranded. I mentioned that there are also two big oversights in the household wealth report, and the first is that the Fed mysteriously does not include the general liabilities of the government when calculating household net wealth. Wouldn't it make sense for the Fed to offset these against household wealth? After all, who else besides the taxpayers living in households are going to pay off those liabilities? Nobody. That's who. If the Fed did perform this offset, household net worth would plunge below zero. So I can guess why this comparison is never made. The second oversight is that the data is presented as if it applied to our entire country in a fairly even and useful manner. It does not. The top 1% owns 35% of all net household wealth, and, looking at stocks only, owns 56% of all stock by value. If you can't see it, I apologize. The top 1% is represented by a very thin red smear at the top of that column there. It's great that our stock market keeps powering higher, but for every $1 trillion it goes up, 560 billion of that goes to only 1 out of 100 households. The top 20%, which includes the top 1%, owns 85% of all household net wealth and 80% of all stocks by value. This means that the bottom 80% of the citizens of this country, represented in yellow, holds only 15% of the total wealth of this country. Remember, an imbalance between rich and poor is the oldest and most fatal ailment of all republics. More immediately, this tells us that our credit crisis is going to be worse than advertised. Just as was true of the wealth gap in the late 1920s, before the onset of the Great Depression, the severity of the crisis will not depend on average wealth, but on the distribution of the wealth. If a large swath of the population lacks the means to weather the storm, then that storm will be longer and harsher than otherwise would be the case. So what does it mean that 80% of our population possesses a meager 15% of the total wealth? For one thing, it means that recent efforts by the Fed to provide massive amounts of liquidity to support the biggest and wealthiest banks at the inflationary expense of the lower classes were not only misguided, but they were cruel and unusual. This leads to an easy prediction to make. The wealth gap in the United States will hamper our recovery and deepen the downturn. In order to really understand why I have been harping on this notion of assets being variable and their value being dependent on the ratio of buyers to sellers, we'll need to take a quick trip into demographics. Recall that the U.S. government has not saved in any of its entitlement programs, and that it has a massive shortfall in them, measuring the tens of trillions of dollars. That situation comes about because the entitlement programs are really wealth transfer programs, not savings accounts, and so they depend on a significant surplus of current workers to retirees. The shortfalls in these programs are being exacerbated by a troubling trend. In 1950, there were 7 workers per retiree, and the system was balanced. By 2005, that ratio had dropped to only 5 to 1, and the system was already exhibiting signs of distress. By 2030, that ratio will have plummeted to a thoroughly unworkable value of less than 3 to 1. And this trend comes about as a feature of the so-called baby boom. This is a demographic chart of the United States, and each bar represents a clustering of all the people who are within a 5-year wide age window, as seen on the left axis. The baby boomers number around 75 million strong, and roughly occupy these 4 bands. While it may not seem like much, the hole that exists in the population behind the baby boomers represents an enormous challenge and even threat to our entitlement programs, and will greatly complicate our efforts to resolve our levels of debt and our national failure to save. A more normal population distribution, if you will, and the kind that humans evolved with over countless millennia, looks like this: a pyramid. Again, this shows 5-year wide age brackets, with men in red and women in yellow. This distribution is capable of supporting an entitlement program, such as the one in the US, that is based on transferring wealth directly from workers to retirees. But when we cast this chart forward to 2000, the baby boomer bulge is quite apparent. Besides the challenge that this demographic profile offers to the entitlement programs, an even larger challenge is presented to both the debt and savings issues I painted in previous chapters, and even to the value of our assets. Here's what I mean. The boomers are the wealthiest generation ever. They hold nearly all of the assets, and they will need to dispose of those assets to fund their retirements. Who exactly are the boomers planning on selling their assets to? This guy? Even if his generation somehow could afford to buy all these assets, there simply aren't enough people in his generation to buy them. In order to fund their retirement dreams, boomers are going to have to sell off their assets. And again, we might wonder, to whom exactly? And lastly, if the massive accumulation of debt over the past 23 years was predicated on the assumption that the future will be much larger than the present, we might also question how exactly that will come to pass if boomers are retiring en masse and there are fewer behind them to take their place. Man, the next generation better be prepared to work really, really hard. Too bad they're graduating with the highest levels of college debt ever recorded. This sort of demographic profile will be with us for decades and cannot be wished away or fixed by some clever policy. It is simply a fact of life, and one that we do well to recognize and plan for rather than ignore. Boomer retirement has already begun, and the pace of this will accelerate rapidly over the next 15 years, which will make the 20-teens quite interesting, and leads me to conclude that the next 20 years are going to be completely unlike the last 20 years. Okay, now that we've taken a look at U.S. assets, we need to spend some time understanding what an asset bubble is, how one might form, and the consequences of the aftermath. And we are specifically going to examine the housing bubble in detail, because it's the largest bubble in all of history and will probably be the most destructive. Through the long sweep of history, the bursting of asset bubbles has nearly always been traumatic. Social, political, and economic upheavals have a bad habit of following asset bubbles, while wealth destruction is a guaranteed feature. Along the continuum of irrational financial behavior, it can be tricky to tell the difference between a bubble, a mania, and a mere touch of exuberance. A bubble is reserved for the height of folly, and history is rich with folly. Bubbles used to happen once every generation or so, because it took time to forget the pain from the damage. Less than 10 years after the bursting of the .com bubble, we saw the bursting of the housing bubble. This is simply astounding and thoroughly unprecedented. So how would we know that we're in an asset bubble? What do they look like? And what can we expect when one bursts? The Fed famously likes to claim that you can't spot one until it bursts. But actually you can, and the definition is pretty simple. A bubble exists when asset price inflation rises beyond what incomes can sustain. A bubble represents people abandoning reason and prudence for hope and greed. Out of that prior list of bubbles, let's look at one of the more interesting ones that occurred in Holland in the 1600s. For some reason, the people of that time became infatuated with tulips, saw them as a surefire path to riches, and a financial mania set in around them. Yes, we're talking about the flowers that come from bulbs. The bubble began when beautiful and unique variants in tulip coloration were developed, and bulbs began trading at higher and higher amounts as the speculative frenzy built. At the height of the bubble, a single bulb of the most highly sought-after example, the Semper Augustus, commanded the same selling price as the finest house on the finest canal. But eventually, people figured out that you can actually grow quite a few tulip bulbs if you set your mind to it, and that perhaps bulbs were, after all, just bulbs. It is recorded that the tulip craze ended even more suddenly than it began, ending almost in a single day at the start of the new selling season in February of 1637. On that day, a silent whistle blew that only dogs and buyers could hear, and prices crashed. This example illustrates two characteristics of bubbles. First, that they are self-reinforcing on the way up, meaning that higher prices become the justification for higher prices. And second, that once the illusion is lifted, the game is suddenly and permanently over. A second example of a bubble comes from the 1700s and goes by the name the South Sea Bubble. The South Sea Company was an English company which was granted a monopoly to trade with South America under a treaty with Spain. The fact that the company was rather ordinary in its profits prior to the government monopoly did not deter people from speculating wildly about its potential future value, and the share price rose dramatically. Nor did the fact that the company was billed as a company for carrying out an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. Sir Isaac Newton, when asked about the continually rising stock price of the South Sea Company, said that he could not calculate the madness of people. He may have invented calculus, and also described universal gravitation, but he also ended up losing over 20,000 pounds to the bursting bubble, proving that intelligence is often no match for a bubble. In 1720, the South Sea mania took off, displaying a textbook-perfect example of an asset bubble. Here we see reflected two additional essential features of bubbles. They are roughly symmetrical in both time and price. That is, however long it took to create the bubble is roughly the amount of time it will take to unwind the bubble, and prices usually get fully retraced, if not a bit more. Here we can see those features in perfect form. Keep an eye on this shape. We'll be seeing it again and again and again. And here, in a chart of the Dow Jones beginning in 1921, we can see that the stock bubble that preceded the Great Depression followed roughly the same trajectory, requiring about as much time to deflate as it did to inflate, and that prices roughly returned to the levels from which they started. And here's the stock price of GM in the blue line between the years 1912 and 1922, and Intel, in the red line, between 1992 and 2002, periods during which both stocks were swept up in bubbles. Here we might also note that the price data looks very similar for both stocks, despite the fact that they reflect a car company and a high-tech chip manufacturer separated by a span of more than 80 years. The fact that bubbles display the same price behaviors over the centuries and decades tells us that they are not artifacts of particular financial systems, but rather are shaped by the human emotions of greed, fear, and hope. Those have not changed through the years, and this is why you should hold on to your wallet any time you hear the words, "This time it's different." Somewhere along the way, people started to believe this about houses. It got to the point that people began to really believe that a house was a path to riches, and even better, it was a magical path that would transport you to Easy Street, even if you sat on your sofa the whole time drinking beverages. Now, there's simply no way for this to be true, and we should have known better. But bubbles usually have their way with the masses. Regardless, over the long haul, house prices will be set by whatever it costs to build a new house, meaning that inflation will ultimately dictate house prices. This amazing chart of inflation-adjusted house prices created by Robert Shiller reveals that between 1890 and 1998, house prices tracked the rate of inflation very closely. In this chart, any time the line is rising, houses are appreciating faster than the rate of inflation, and any time the line is falling, they are losing ground compared to inflation. Over this entire 118-year period, house prices averaged 101.2, meaning that inflation-adjusted house prices are roughly comparable across this entire sweep of history. See this little bump right here? That was a property bubble that I still remember clearly because it impacted the Northeast where I lived at the time, and I got to ride my bike through abandoned construction projects, which was great fun. Notice that this property bubble returned to baseline in a fairly symmetrical fashion, as did the property bubble of 1989. Well, if those were property bubbles, then what's this? This housing bubble has no historical precedent and is massively out of proportion to anything we've ever experienced before. There's nothing even remotely close to it in magnitude, so we are left without any history to guide us as to what the impacts are likely to be. And also note that this bubble did not suddenly begin in 2004. It began in 1998 and had eclipsed the past two by 2000. You might ask yourself, if the Federal Reserve had access to this data and knew we had a property bubble on our hands as early as 2000, why did they continue to aggressively lower interest rates to 1% and then hold them there for a year between 2003 and 2004? Well, that's a darn good question, and I'll get to that in a minute. Based on this chart, where and when might we predict that this bubble will finally bottom out? Well, symmetry suggests the bottom will be somewhere around 2015, while history suggests that prices will decline by roughly 50% in real terms. The other way we could look at this is in terms of affordability. Again, over the long haul, it is impossible for median house prices to rise faster than median incomes. Why? Because the amount that people can afford to pay sets a limit on house prices. Here's a chart I put together that compares median incomes to median house prices. The bubbles of 1979 and 1989 are not very dramatic on this graph, but there they are, marked by the black arrows. The fact that median incomes did not deviate very far from those prior bubbly house prices helped to limit the impact of the bursting of those bubbles, painful though they were, because incomes and house prices did not have to travel very far to once again meet up. This time, again, we have no historical precedent for the gap between income gains and house prices, and we see disturbing signs as early as 1999 that things were getting off track. Based on income gains alone, how much would house prices have to fall to bring these lines back together? The answer is 34% nationally, indicating that there's still a long way to go yet. Given the propensity of bubbles to overshoot to the downside, we can't discount that a 40% or even 50% decline is in the cards. Here we might also guesstimate that house prices would bottom somewhere in the vicinity of 2012 to 2015. Remember, a bubble exists when asset price inflation rises beyond what incomes can sustain. And that's exactly what we see in this chart. So where was the Fed during all of this? Well, they were busy writing research papers convincing themselves that there was no housing bubble, as seen in this 2004 Fed study entitled, "Are Home Prices the Next Bubble?" The main summary of the study started off on a good note, stating, "Home prices have been rising strongly since the mid-1990s, prompting concerns that a bubble exists in this asset class and that home prices are vulnerable to a collapse that could harm the U.S. economy." But then the main conclusion of the paper veered sharply off into a ditch, reading, "A close analysis of the U.S. housing market in recent years, however, finds little basis for such concerns. The marked upturn in home prices is largely attributable to strong market fundamentals. Home prices have essentially moved in line with increases in family income and declines in nominal mortgage interest rates." Essentially moved in line with increases in family income? What? One of the most widely known facts of our time is that family incomes did not move up at all on an inflation-adjusted basis during the housing boom, and is one of the principal economic failures of the first decade of the millennium. This just goes to show that the Federal Reserve is either stocked with inept or biased researchers, and of the two, I'm not sure which makes me feel worse about our chances of safely navigating through this mess. But the Fed's researchers were simply doing what millions of people did. namely, falling prey to believing that somehow, this time it's different. But that's just how bubbles are. People take leave of their senses, use all manner of rationales to justify their positions, but then, suddenly, one day the illusion lifts, and what seemed to be unassailably true no longer makes any sense at all. Once that day happens, the fate of the bubble is reduced to measuring the speed of its collapse. While it's tempting to lay the blame for what's happening on the housing bubble, it's important to remember that the dramatic rise in house prices was itself just a symptom of a credit bubble run amok. Total credit at the end of 2000, when the stock bubble was bursting, stood at $27 trillion. By the end of 2007, it stood at an astounding $48 trillion. This $21 trillion increase in borrowing is 5 times larger than the increase in U.S. GDP over the same period of time. Any attempt to understand the housing bubble has to be viewed against the backdrop of this massive increase in debt. But as we noted in an earlier chapter, this credit bubble has been going on for 25 years. Unwinding a multi-generational debt binge is going to require some enormous changes in attitudes and habits. One reason that any bubble, but especially a housing bubble like this one, is so destructive is because so many bad investments are made along the way. Too many houses were built, too many shopping centers, and too many condos, and nearly all of them too large and ill-positioned for a future of expensive energy. Sorry to say, but all those trillions of dollars were wasted, and worse, stole opportunities from the things that needed money more. The Austrian School of Economics has a very crisp and historically accurate definition of how a credit bubble ends. According to Ludwig von Mises, there is no means of avoiding the final collapse of a boom brought about by credit expansion. The alternative is only whether the crisis should come sooner as a result of a voluntary abandonment of further credit expansion, or later as a final and total catastrophe of the currency system involved. This is a view I happen to ascribe to and explains my strong preference for placing my wealth out of the path of a potential dollar collapse. As a nation, we've undertaken desperate measures to avoid abandoning the continuation of our credit expansion, leaving a final catastrophe of the currency as our most likely outcome. As for the timing, it could hardly be worse. Dealing with a bursting housing bubble is hardly the sort of challenge we need at this particular moment in history, but here we are. The stewardship and vision displayed by the Federal Reserve in Washington, D.C. in bringing all of this about has been utterly atrocious. So, what can we expect from a collapsing credit bubble? Simply put, everything that fed upon and grew as a consequence of too much easy credit will collapse. I am especially leery of financial stocks, low-grade bonds, and of course, real estate. I see very few conventional ways to protect one's wealth, and so I invite you to begin asking yourself, and if you have one, your financial advisor, some very hard questions about the safety of your holdings. You'll be glad you did. Remember, this time it's probably not different. What if it's true, as Kevin Phillips recently stated in an article in Harper's, that ever since the 1960s, Washington has gulled its citizens and creditors by debasing official statistics, the vital instruments with which the vigor and muscle of the American economy are measured? What if it turned out that our individual, corporate, and government decision-making was based on deeply misleading, if not provably false data? That's what we're going to take a look at here by examining the ways that inflation and gross domestic product, or GDP, are measured. As you know, inflation is a matter of active policy. Too little in our current banking system risks failure. Too much, and the majority of people noticeably lose their savings, which makes them politically restive. So keeping inflation at a Goldilocks temperature, not too hot and not too cold, is the name of the game. Inflation has two components. The first is the simple pressure on prices due to too much money floating around. The second component lies with people's expectations of future inflation. If expectations are that inflation will be tame, they are said to be well anchored. If people expect prices to rise, they tend to spend their money now while the getting is still good, and this serves to fuel further inflation in a self-reinforcing manner. The faster people spend, the faster inflation rises. Zimbabwe is a perfect modern example of this dynamic in play. Accordingly, official inflation policy has two components. The first is regulating the money supply, and the second is anchoring your expectations. And how exactly is this anchoring accomplished? Over time, this has evolved into little more than telling you that inflation is a bit lower, or even a lot lower, than it actually is. The details of how this is done are more complicated, but worthy of your attention. Let me be clear. The tricks and subversions that we will examine did not arise with any particular administration or political party. Rather, they arose incrementally during every administration you would care to examine over the past 40 years. Under Kennedy, who disliked high unemployment numbers, a new classification was developed that scrubbed so-called discouraged workers from the headline data, causing unemployment figures to drop. Johnson created the unified budget that we currently enjoy, which rolls surplus Social Security funds into the general budget where they are spent, but then not reported as part of the deficit that you read about. Richard Nixon bequeathed us the so-called core inflation measure, which strips out food and fuel, which, as Barry Ritholtz says, is like reporting inflation ex-inflation. While it was Bill Clinton who left us with the current tangled statistical morass that is now our official method of measuring inflation. At every turn, a new way of measuring and reporting was derived that invariably served to make things seem a bit rosier than they actually were. Economic activity was higher, inflation was lower, sometimes a lot lower, and jobs were more plentiful. Unfortunately, the cumulative impact of all this data manipulation is that our measurements no longer match reality. We are, in effect, telling ourselves lies, and these fibs serve to distort our decisions and jeopardize our economic future. So let's begin with inflation, which is reported to us by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS, in the form of the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. If you were to measure inflation, you'd probably track the cost of a basket of goods from one year to the next, subtract the two, and measure the difference. And your method would in fact be the way inflation was officially measured right on up through the early 1980s. But in 1996, Clinton implemented the Boskin Commission findings, which now have us measuring inflation using these three oddities: substitution, weighting, and hedonics. To begin on this list, we no longer simply measure the cost of goods and services from one year to the next because of something called the substitution effect. Thanks to the Boskin Commission, it is now assumed that when the price of something rises, people will switch to something cheaper. So any time, say, that the price of salmon goes up too much, it is removed from the basket of goods and substituted with something cheaper like hot dogs. By this methodology, the BLS says that food costs rose 4.1% from 2007 to 2008. However, according to the Farm Bureau, which does not do this and simply tracks the exact same shopping basket of 30 goods from one year to the next, food prices rose 11.3% over the past year, compared to the BLS, who say that they only rose 4.1%. Now that's a huge difference. One impact of using substitution is that our measure of inflation no longer measures the cost of living, but the cost of survival. Next, anything that rises too quickly in price is now subjected to so-called geometric weighting, in which goods and services that are rising most rapidly in price get a lower weighting in this CPI basket, under the assumption that people will use less of those things. Using the government's own statistics from two different sources, we find that healthcare is about 17% of our total economy, but it is only weighted as 6% of the CPI basket. Because healthcare costs are rising extremely rapidly, the impact of including a much smaller healthcare weighting is a reduction in reported inflation. By simply reinstating the actual level of healthcare spending, our reported CPI would be several percent higher. But the most outlandish adjustment of them all goes by the name hedonics, the Greek root of which means for the pleasure of. This adjustment is supposed to adjust for quality improvements, especially those that lead to greater enjoyment or utility of the product, but it has been badly overused. Here's an example. Tim LaFleur is a commodity specialist for televisions at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, where the CPI is calculated. I'm guessing he works in a place that looks like this. In 2004, he noted that a 27-inch television selling for $329.99 was selling for the same price last year, but was now equipped with a better screen. After taking this subjective improvement into account, he adjusted the price of the TV downwards by $135, concluding that the screen improvement was the same as if the price of the TV had fallen by 29%. The price reflected in the CPI was not the actual retail store cost of $329.99, which is what it would cost you to buy, but $195. Bingo! At the BLS, TVs now cost less and inflation is heading down. At the store, they're still selling for $329.99. And hedonics are a one-way trip. If I get a new phone this year and it has some new buttons, the BLS will say that the price has dropped. But if this new phone only lasts 8 months instead of 30 years like my old phone, no adjustment will be made for that loss. In short, hedonics rests on the improbable assumption that new features are always beneficial and are synonymous with falling prices. Over the years, the BLS has expanded the use of hedonic adjustments and now applies them to everything from TVs to automobiles, washers, dryers, refrigerators, and even to college textbooks. Hedonics are now used to adjust as much as 46% of the total CPI. So what would happen if we were to strip out all the fuzzy statistical manipulations and calculate inflation like we used to do it? Luckily, John Williams of shadowstats.com has done exactly that, painstakingly following each statistical modification over time and reversing their effects. If inflation were calculated today the exact same way it was in the early 1980s, Mr. Williams finds that it would be running closer to 13% than the currently reported 5%. This is a stunning 8% difference, which explains much that we see around us. It explains why people have had to borrow more and have been able to save less because the real income was actually a lot lower than reported. A higher rate of inflation is consistent with weak labor markets and growing levels of debt. It fits the monetary growth data better. So many things that were difficult to explain under a low inflation reading suddenly make a lot of sense if inflation is assumed to be higher. The social cost to this self-deception is enormous. For starters, if inflation were calculated like it used to be, Social Security payments, whose increases are based on the CPI, would be 70% larger than today. Because Medicare increases are also tied to the CPI, hospitals are increasingly unable to balance their budgets, forcing many communities to lose services. These are real impacts. But besides paying out less in entitlement checks, by understating inflation, politicians gain in another very important way. Gross domestic product, or GDP, is how we tell ourselves that our economy is either doing well or doing poorly. In theory, the GDP is the sum total of all value-added transactions within our country in any given year. Here's an example, though, of how far from reality GDP has strayed. The reported number for 2003 was a GDP of $11 trillion, implying that $11 trillion of money-based, value-added economic transactions had occurred. However, nothing of the sort happened. First, that $11 trillion included $1.6 trillion of imputations, where it was assumed that economic value had been created, but no actual transactions took place. The largest of these imputations was the value that the owner of a house receives by not having to pay themselves rent. Did you follow that? If you own your house, the government adds how much they think you should have been paying yourself in rent to live there, and adds that amount to the GDP. Another is the benefit that you receive from the free checking provided by your bank, which is imputed to have a value because if it weren't free, then you'd have to pay for it. So that value is guesstimated and added to the GDP as well. Together, just these two imputations add up to over $1 trillion of our reported GDP. Next, the GDP has many elements that are hedonically adjusted. For instance, computers are hedonically adjusted to account for the idea that because they are faster and more feature-rich than in past years, they must be contributing more to our economic output than their price alone would indicate. So if a $1,000 computer were sold, it would be recorded as contributing more than $1,000 to the GDP. Of course, that extra money is fictitious in the sense that it never traded hands and it doesn't exist. What's interesting is that for the purposes of inflation measurements, hedonic adjustments are used to reduce the apparent price of computers, but for GDP calculations, hedonic adjustments are used to boost their apparent price. Hedonics, therefore, are used to maneuver prices higher or lower, depending on which outcome makes things look more favorable. So, what were the total hedonic adjustments in 2003? An additional whopping $2.3 trillion. Taken together, These mean that $3.9 trillion, or fully 35% of our reported GDP, was not based on transactions that you could witness, record, or touch. They were guessed at, modeled, or imputed, but they did not show up in any bank accounts because no cash ever changed hands. As an aside, when you hear people say things like, our debt to GDP is still quite low, or income taxes as a percentage of GDP are historically low, it's important to remember that because GDP is artificially high, any ratio where GDP is in the denominator will be artificially low. Now, let's tie in inflation to the GDP story. The GDP you read about is always inflation adjusted and reported after inflation is subtracted from it. This is called the real GDP, while the pre-inflation adjusted number is called the nominal GDP. This is an important thing to do because GDP is supposed to measure real output, not the impact of inflation. Here's an example. If our economy consisted of producing lava lamps, and we produced one of them in one year, and one of them the next year, we'd want to record our GDP growth rate as 0, because our output is exactly the same in both years. So, if we sold a lava lamp for $100 one year, but $110 the next, we'd accidentally record a 10% GDP increase if we didn't back out the price increases. So in this example, the real lava lamp economy has a value of $100, while the nominal lava lamp economy is $110. And because we're trying to measure the real economy, inflation must be removed from the picture. Now we can begin to understand the second powerful reason that DC loves a low inflation reading. It's because GDP is expressed in real terms. It works like this. In the third quarter of 2007, it was reported that we experienced a very surprising and strong 4.9% rate of GDP growth. At the time, there were many proud officials declaring that certain tax cuts or these programs or whatnot were responsible for this excellent news. Less well reported was the fact that nominal GDP was 5.9%, from which was deducted the jaw-droppingly low inflation reading of 1%, giving us the final result of 4.9%. In order to believe this 4.9% figure, you have to first believe that our nation was experiencing a 1% rate of inflation during the same period that oil was first approaching $100 a barrel, and inflation was obviously and irrefutably exploding all over the globe. Lest you think I've cherry-picked an accidental one-time embarrassing statistical BLS moment here, here's a chart of the so-called GDP deflator, which is the specific measure of inflation that is subtracted from nominal GDP to yield the reported real GDP. As you can see, for the past 15 quarters, the Bureau of Economic Analysis has been serenely and systematically subtracting lower and lower amounts of inflation, which simply flies in the face of both real-world inflation data and common sense. Remember, each percent that inflation is understated equals a full percent that GDP is overstated. If this is not lying to ourselves, then delusional is the next word that comes to my mind. If, instead, we make our own assumptions about inflation, or we use those of John Williams, and subtract these from the reported GDP numbers, then we find that we've been in a solid recession for quite a while now. Suddenly a lot of things that were difficult to understand make perfect sense. Contracting businesses, rising foreclosures, job losses, rising budget deficits, falling tax revenues, declining auto sales, all of these are consistent with recession, and not expansion. The same sort of statistical wizardry that we've just explored here is performed on income, unemployment figures, house prices, budget deficits, and virtually every other government-supplied economic statistic you can think of. Each is laced with a long series of lopsided imperfections that inevitably paint a rosier picture than is warranted. We are now in the midst of a fearful credit crisis, a bursting bubble, and the first wave of boomer retirements, and solid, credible information is what we need as a beacon to find our way out. To close with Kevin Phillips again, our nation may truly regret losing sight of history, risk, and common sense. I couldn't agree more.